when it was the open body, so I oh no, yeah.
He probably knows. Oh yeah,
He's very clever on the sports rocks. Well, that document from Rudy Mackenzie's office is data and he's looking Where did your job start from? But I found it one like the wardrobes in the house. I've been sitting in there for years. And I thought it was so beautiful. It's lovely. Without makeup. I haven't used it. And I wore it on Wednesday the other day. And then he went past me. I wish I knew, I know you had it. I had to go through purple card when I first got here. And I would have been excited. Well, there's enough about even there. I think you should make up a story in that each village are and the back streets of it.
I understood that the claim was that that's the John first personal payment, not an organisation.
When you leave this place,
There will be. You can always lie and in some when they see that's it there, long corridor. Play with them, family, that okay, so I mean, that sounds an odd nice. I think that's probably the intention. So let's just talk. So is that position okay, or do you want it to be on your on the first?
I never managed to do any of this.
Okay, what's the next one? Oh,
Oh, no. Oh, yeah, no, do it from there. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you to Manning Clark House because it's all of 24 hours since we had an event here before, and we'll be having many more, as you probably know. We've got 2 in March. Off the top of my head, haven't got the dates, and then we've got the Manning Clark lecture coming up on the 22nd of April, and that's by going to be given by somebody called Tim, not Peter, Costello. So that should be very, very interesting. Now I'll be Tony Kevin, 3rd of April. 3rd of April, I think. Thanks for telling us first. I haven't got all those dates in my head. And I've been most recently, I didn't thank the former owners of this land and who bequeathed it to us, and we are hopefully using it in a way in which they would like. And so we're all very grateful to them. Now, what we do here, we have talks of various sorts, and there's certain rules here in the house, certain rules, and one absolute certain is that no Germans are allowed to speak here, no Germans. And somebody suggested to me recently we should also have another one, no Italians.
Oh.
But I temporarily rejected that one. Temporarily rejected it because we don't start getting alarmed if you've got any non-Australians present here. Sorry?
Yeah, I was about to say, is Ingrid here? Is Ingrid here?
Yes, Ingrid here, but she was
She's at another function.
Yeah, no, she wasn't allowed in.
Oh.
Not allowed in. And here's me talking with the Northern European ancestry half, and I'm pretty sure somewhere, although I've never actually detected it, there must be some German in it. Because, you know, a Swede, a Norwegian and a Belgian, they're likely to have had some sort of connection with Germans at some stage.
So we should kick you out.
Yeah, last far on you. Anyway, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Frank, and I'm looking forward to it very much talking. He's apparently talking about something which doesn't exist in Australia, and so good luck to him talking about that. That is leadership, and I don't think it does exist. We'll find out. We'll find out. In the course of my travels, as I was telling Frank before, I have actually not necessarily current, but I've actually met 6 Prime Ministers of Australia at various times, mainly through my good father. The very first one, as I was saying before, was outside the MCHI for the Don Bradman testimonial game, and when my father started chatting to this old man, and I didn't want to listen, I wanted to go in to watch the game. There was a fellow called Robert Gordon Menzies, and so I've actually spoken to him, and also, I've been most risk, I didn't mention this, talking positive. The day after my father died, there was a knock on the door, and this bloke came in and he wanted to talk to me and 2 of my brothers, and he sat here for an hour. It was the current treasurer. He wasn't Prime Minister then, but he came as Paul Keating, and it was an incredibly decent thing to do, incredibly decent thing. And because my good father actually had spoken to him in January, and he said to me, and he spoke to him quite often actually, and they really had D&Ms. I'm absolutely convinced. And he said, after the last one, my father said to him, I just had a very interesting talk to Paul Keating. I'll tell you about it sometime. So I'll have to wait till I go upstairs to hear what's taken. And I'm pretty sure actually the last one they were talking about, when should I strike? This is Keating talking. I'm pretty sure they talked about that. And it's significant that he was here on the Friday, and he said that the Hawks mobs running around Parliament House saying, I'm going to challenge. I'm not going to, He challenged on the Tuesday. So, there we go. So that's an aside. But I really am looking forward to Frank, and I'm sure that he's got very many important things to say about leadership. You're not going to talk about Putin, are you?
I mentioned him once.
Oh, okay, there you go. There you go.
Bob Hawke gave Labor's policy speech in the Opera House in Sydney. Malcolm Fraser, the Liberal Prime Minister, was also in Sydney that day, and in the evening he addressed a rally in the Randwick Town Hall. Now, by the time Fraser returned to Kirribilli House, it was clear that the country was in the grip of a disaster. It, of course, would become known as Ash Wednesday, the Ash Wednesday bushfires. Fraser immediately rang the Labor premiers of the 2 states affected, John Cain and John Bannon, and offered whatever help they needed. He immediately phoned Army Command, which soon mobilised troops and supplies. He rang senior public servants in his own department to ask them to arrange bushfire relief. He worked until 3 in the morning. To his staff, he seemed a changed man. The faltering election campaigner, who seemed well and truly on a course to lose, suddenly once again was the strong leader he'd announced himself back in 1975. He cancelled plans to campaign in Tasmania the next day, and instead spent the day in bushfire-ravaged areas in places such as the Adelaide Hills, and indeed in his own electorate of Wannon in Western Victoria, where there was a very serious bushfire on that Ash Wednesday. And he did the same the following day. The election campaign was, with the agreement of the major parties, suspended, much to Fraser's cost. They lost 4 days of campaigning, and of course he was behind Hawke, so there was very little prospect of him really being able to gain any advantage from any of this. In electoral terms, there's no evidence that he thought in those terms anyway, and it probably didn't cost him the election, but it certainly didn't help. Some people have seen it as a kind of nail in his coffin. Now, the contrast between Fraser and Scott Morrison will probably have occurred to you by now. With Sydney surrounded by bushfires in December 2019, Morrison called a press conference on the Religious Freedom Bill. Then it was time for a holiday with the family. Ham-fistedly, he sought to cover his tracks, the fact that he was in Hawaii, with his office lying to the media about his whereabouts. Then, once persuaded to return, he remained largely out of sight. There was a function at that very same Kirribilli House on New Year's Eve, with its splendid views of the Sydney fireworks, and then there was time there the following day with the Australian cricket team, whose exploits, he said, would be an inspiration to bushfire victims. Responding to a question in a radio interview about his apparent lack of action and leadership, he reminded the interviewer that it was not his job to hold the hose. Now, by the time he turned up in fire-ravaged communities on the south coast of New South Wales, he'd already done his dash. When a young woman refused to shake his hand, he decided to grab it from her side and shake it anyway, as one does. Some residents abused him. A fiery also refused to shake his hand and walked away from him. All of this, of course, caught on video, and it made for excruciating viewing, although his efforts to bring comfort to the people were no worse than the amateurish Liberal Party advertisement that his office issued, complete with a background of Muzak pulled off the internet to announce to the country all of the big things his government was now doing. At every turn, Morrison seemed unsuited to dealing with a crisis in which vast numbers of people saw their country being destroyed and their lives falling apart. So how did we get from Malcolm Fraser, a Prime Minister I suspect most of us in this room didn't have very much time for back in the day? How do we get from him to Scott Morrison, the can-do, practical man of action who doesn't hold the hose? Why has the epithet Scotty from marketing clung to him as securely as pig iron to Bob Menzies? How did we end up with a Prime Minister so incapable of leadership, so hollow, a kind of national whoopee cushion who emits a high-pitched wheeze when placed under pressure, such as by journalists asking him questions he doesn't want to answer, a hologram in a baseball cap, a Sharks jersey and scarf, goofy grin, worn like the Cheshire Cats, that is, there's nothing behind it, and the thumbs up to let us know that everything's just fine. More Rodney Dangerfield than Ronald Reagan. The man around whom odd things happen, and they tend to happen to his advantage, but who himself says he did nothing to make them happen. The man who fails as a tourism executive, but moves onward and upward and without a backward glance. The man who loses miserably, in fact, the pre-selection contest, but wins it when false and nasty stories circulate about his victorious opponent in the Daily Telegraph. The man who is not a challenger, but who comes through the middle to take the crown. The man who complains of the coalition being the Muppet Show, a show in which he's in fact starred for years, and who complains of the Canberra bubble, a bubble which he's long inhabited and in which he's flourished. The man who promises nothing but is elected anyway. The man who is forever telling us about Jen and the girls, but only to use them as human shields when the going gets tough. The man whose office sends back and forth dozens and dozens of emails, but was never around when decisions were being made to rort a $100 million sports grant scheme. So here's our Prime Minister in 2020. I always thought it was fitting in the 1980s when we ended, or the Liberal Party ended, by placing a free market academic economist, John Hewson, at the head of that party. It kind of summed up, in a way, what politics had increasingly become over that decade, certainly for many of those in the political class. It's essentially a matter of economics in which the opinions of the markets mattered at least as much as the opinions of voters, and probably a great deal more. Now, of course, we have not an economist really, but a marketing man. And our politics today most resembles marketing, a world of marketing in which the message itself has essentially become the product. The British figure, I think, from recent politics, I lived obviously in Britain a few years and saw the beginnings of this Prime Ministership. The British figure that Morrison resembles in his career path isn't Boris Johnson, it's David Cameron. It's David Cameron, who worked before politics as a party professional, much as Morrison did, and as a director of corporate affairs for a media company, which I think quite neatly parallels Morrison's role in tourism. Now, I would accept that the politics of Cameron, and indeed of Morrison, are admittedly a less debased politics than a politics dominated by a demented and amoral reality TV star. But that politics nonetheless has its own dangers. Cameron's astute leadership, after all, gave Britain Brexit, and his decision-making, and I think this is the critical thing and something he shares with Morrison, his decision-making largely reflected a belief that voters could be managed. Millions and millions of voters could be managed to make the right decisions by supposed experts in their manipulation, by marketing types who could do it. And of course, that's been shown certainly in the British case, to be a very hollow sort of claim. And perhaps we're also seeing its hollowness emerging in the Australian case. When he became Prime Minister, Morrison had just a few months to turn things around, but the only early sign of hope for the government was that his approval rating as Prime Minister quickly exceeded that of Bill Shorten, perhaps not a huge achievement. There were various stunts of the kind that remind us how truly debased our politics have become. Some nutter has put some pins in strawberries. No issue is too trivial to be absorbed into a grand melodrama of good versus evil before the law takes its course and most people forget about it and move on. The Parliament passes Medivac legislation against the will of the government. Let's take a media contingent to Christmas Island for a 30-minute press conference because it'll score a few political points amongst a certain cohort of voters to whom you're wishing to appeal. When Morrison's efforts to play the strong leader, and that's what I think these attempts were, this was the man who was kind of like a war leader, when that failed, Morrison concentrated on cultivating what Phil Coury called a daggy ordinariness. His political persona was publicly unveiled, and I'll make the case for this in a moment, in January 2019, not in the latter months of 2018, but in mid-January, we can date it basically, mid-January 2019. A brilliant exercise in public relations. It underpinned the strategy that he maintained all the way up to election day. Labor, as it's admitted in its post-election review, was caught wrong-footed. Political parties, of course, have long used marketing expertise. There's nothing new about any of that. But we've never had a product of that industry as Prime Minister, so far as I'm aware. Nor have we ever seen a government go to the voters with most of its ministers and policies in hiding. Now, the unveiling, I'd argue, occurred in an article in the Daily Telegraph. It was shared more widely in the Murdoch media on the 14th of January 2019. In due course, I think, that article should become for Morrison what the Forgotten People broadcast was for Menzies. I think the fruits of Morrison's Prime Ministership are shaping up as pretty sour, but nonetheless they are clearly emblematic of our times and of much that's happening in our politics, and so we need to take this stuff seriously. Now, Morrison's op-ed of mid-January was purportedly inspired by his family holiday, which was not on that occasion in Hawaii, but on the south coast of New South Wales, the very same south coast, of course, which would be burning a year later. Morrison encountered, and I quote, no sign of the angry mob on social and in other media, shouting at each other and telling us all what we're supposed to do, think and say. Rather, the place, the south coast, was full of people with a positive outlook. Locals, holidaymakers staying at caravan parks, small business people from Western Sydney, surf lifesavers, fishing and rural fire service members, professionals, kids, mums, retirees, pensioners. It was refreshing. Unquote. I wasn't there on any political visit, Morrison hastened to add. Of course, he was quickly turning it into one with his op-ed piece. The place was full of people just like him, apparently, holidaying with Jen and the girls, enjoying the flathead and chips like everyone else. Morrison was gratified by what he had supposedly discovered there. This, and I quote, great reminder that there are quite a lot of us who actually think Australia is a pretty great place and we don't really have too much time to be angry. I guess it is a long way down market from the Forgotten People, really, isn't it? But anyway, you get my point. Morrison contrasted these people, whom he called at this stage quieter Australians, with the angry, noisy voices of a pessimistic minority who, by implication, don't drink in hotels on the New South Wales South Coast, don't order flathead and chips, and don't think Australia is a pretty great place. These quieter Australians were mainly interested in jobs, the cost of living, and other everyday issues, and they wanted policies that would allow us to get ahead. To get ahead of whom or what, he didn't say, but political language of this kind, of course, is full of that kind of evasion. They believe in welfare for the less fortunate, but resent giving people a free ride. They want better services, but they also want taxes to be as low as possible. They want to see their kids safe, well educated, and with smiles on their faces. They care about the environment, especially locally, But Morrison doesn't directly mention climate change. Australians can always be counted on to make and keep our commitments, he assured his readers, but Australians must always come first. He was not going to sign up to destroy our economy because of the extreme views of some. We need to wean ourselves off coal eventually, but let's not do anything that might involve higher taxes or unaffordable subsidies. Just keep it sensible. We'll get there, he assured readers. Well, we're there now. We're there now. A little more than a year later, much of the article, of course, looks ridiculous when it doesn't look like an elaborate, although, as it turned out, highly successful confidence trip. Of course, Morrison was not describing anything. He was prescribing. He was prescribing. Throughout the piece, he wrote of we, as if to dramatise his own sharing of the desirable values that he'd set out. The most desirable of them all, of course, being to keep one's mouth closed about politics. That's really what a quiet Australian is. On this matter, quiet Australians were expected to leave the job of running things to professionals, such as Morrison, who by some unexplained magic could be both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. That's really where I want to go now with my discussion of political leadership. So they're just like everyone else, with their flat head and chips and Jen and the girls, but of course they're special. They're also Prime Minister. They write op-eds in the lead up to an election in the Murdoch press. This performance of leadership is closest to what the late political psychologist Graham Little called group leadership. Little distinguished, he had three types of leadership, that he thought he found in politics. He wasn't suggesting that people didn't mix and match, but he was suggesting there were three kind of varieties. He distinguished strong from group and inspiring leaders or leadership. Now, strong leaders, who tend to be preferred in parties of the political right, emphasise structure, order and discipline. They offer stark moral alternatives. They promise to protect the community from internal weakness and external enemies. So when Morrison was banging on about pins in strawberries, and when Morrison, obviously was trying to wedge Labor around Medivac, that was his gesture, if you like, towards, what really is the reflex position for right-wing leadership, and that is strong leadership. Graham Little, in the lectures he used to give students like me at Melbourne University, had compared or rather used children's television shows as a way of demonstrating the different kinds of leadership. Strong leadership, he argued, was epitomised by Romper Room. Now, do you remember Romper Room? Hasn't been with us for some years, and our younger people here won't remember Romper Room. But Romper Room had it changed over the years. It was Miss Helena when I was a young boy. Miss Helena was basically in charge. She would always be wearing a dress, at least in my recollection. So there was a clear sort of gender differentiation between boys and girls, men and women. Adults were adults in Romper Room and children were children. And a very strict moral code was being maintained because there was a character in it called the doobie, and the doobie would come out and the doobie would basically tell the children how they should behave. And there were songs about this. Do be an asker. Don't be a help yourself. This kind of stuff. And all of the boys wore clothes that were very clearly boys' clothes. All of the girls wore dresses. And it was all very orderly, and it barely qualified as play. Graham said, here you are seeing strong leadership in action, being modelled by Miss Helena in Romper Room. Then there was group leadership, which is what I'm arguing Scott Morrison mainly does. Group leaders. Now, for Little, Bob Hawke was the obvious contemporary example of group leadership. They stress neighbourliness, translating I'm quoting here from Little, neighbourliness, translating the experience of life in smaller groups, like the family, into the nation as a whole. In Hawke's case, I think it was also, the trade union being translated into the life of the nation, the public bar, I think, and the sporting club being translated into the life of the nation. That was really Hawke's technique in a way. Now, back to children's television. Group leadership was Here's Humphrey. Do you remember Here's Humphrey? Humphrey B. Bear. Now, you think about how Humphrey works as a character. He's big, right? He kind of looks adult because he's big and he's wearing a waistcoat, which most kids don't do, right? So he has some of the qualities of an adult, and yet think of how the real adults on the show interact with him. They also treat him as a kind of child. He's not really an adult. I mean, he doesn't have genitals apart from anything else. He'd have no pants on, but there was nothing much happening down there. He's a liminal figure. He was essentially a liminal figure between adulthood and childhood. Remember where I began this? One of us, but special. Okay? Just like us, but not really. That's the essence of group leadership. And that's why Graham thought that Humphrey B. Bear was very much a model of group leadership. The third category Graham called inspiring leaders or inspiring leadership. Think John F. Kennedy, think Pierre Trudeau, Gough Whitlam in this country, probably Paul. He didn't. In fact, he did live for Paul. I don't know if he said this about Paul Keating. I'd probably include Paul Keating, I think, and probably Malcolm Turnbull. And I've argued that in print. I think Malcolm Turnbull also was unusual. I mean, one of the reasons he was a kind of fish out of water in the Liberal Party wasn't just because of his kind of progressive views, but because he really never pretended to be a strong leader. He wanted to be an inspiring leader in a kind of Whitlamite vein, I think. They value cosmopolitanism, innovativeness, I'm quoting here again from Liddell, a creative society that is diverse and changing. Okay. Now, back to children's television. This one was Play School. Now you think of how Play School works, still works. Those running the show are adults, right? But they don't talk down to the children at home. They play with them. They address them as equals. They explore gender difference rather than emphasising it. Graham liked to, I don't know if this is a real episode, but he claims he saw it. He particularly liked the episode in which John Waters took off his shirt and I think Noni Hazelhurst or something drew things with a marker on his heart and things like that. He thought this you couldn't get anything further from Romper Room. You couldn't get everything further. This for Graham epitomised inspiring leadership in the sense that they're adults, but they're effectively modelling an ideal form of play for children at home, and in essence, they're kind of role-playing as children, okay, in a way. They're role-playing as children, but they're models. And he said this is essentially the manoeuvre that inspiring leaders perform. Within the Liberal Party, of course, so moving on from those three types, within the Liberal Party of Australia, it's strong leaders in this typology who've been the most valued and the most electorally successful. I mean, think Robert Menzies. I think John Howard broadly sought to present himself in this kind of way. I think Malcolm Fraser's poor reputation in the Liberal pantheon today has a lot to do with his perceived failure to live up to the strong leader ideal that he'd held up and indeed performed in 1975 in the lead up to the dismissal. Now, where does this leave Scott Morrison? Well, Scott Morrison isn't a strong leader. He's not a strong leader. And I offer this judgment not as a criticism so much as a simple description of a political reality based on that typology. Think of Sean Kelly. I mean, Sean Kelly wrote a very interesting piece on Morrison late last year in the Monthly. In fact, it wasn't late last year. No, sorry, it was the year before in the Monthly. So, in other words, after Morrison had taken the leadership, but before he became Prime Minister. And Sean Kelly's assessment was that Morrison assures us he has beliefs, but he cannot be held to them because he has not told us what they are. A conviction politician conveniently free, at least publicly, from upsetting convictions. Now, no one would accuse Margaret Thatcher, for instance, of being free from upsetting convictions. On the contrary, one of the ways she worked is she displayed her upsetting convictions and in many cases didn't act on them, but gave the impression that the only reason she wasn't acting upon them because she was surrounded by weaker people. Okay, think of her attitude to something like a capital punishment, for instance. She always liked to give the impression she'd bring it back, but, you know, look at all these lily-livered, weak men who surround me, okay? So, you know, she had the upsetting convictions and did very little to hide them. Morrison isn't a Putin or a Trump, each of whom likes to project himself as a strong and successful version of his adoring followers, an image that probably wouldn't work in Australia, I think, in any case. We have a much more egalitarian culture. Nor is Morrison a Boris Johnson. Johnson appeals to the prejudices of ordinary folk as he understands them, but he doesn't pretend to be one of them if he's, you know, classical education, Eton, Oxford and all the rest of it. In their heart of hearts, the Northerners who voted Tory know that Morrison really does hold them in contempt but needed their votes. But think of Morrison. There's the personal identification with and enactment of the everyday tastes and beliefs and feelings of those he calls his quiet Australians, and of course, you know, his stated desire to frame policy around their supposed needs and interests, although he's doing very little of that sort of thing these days. It seems to me this is a textbook case of group leadership. It's just that he's not very good at it. It's bad or failed group leadership. You know, the mirror image, the opposite or whatever, of Bob Hawke, who, you know, was a splendid group leader. Hawke was everybody's mate. He was absolutely masterful at that kind of performance of leadership. Morrison, by way of contrast, is an increasingly inept group leader. His everyday mixing with ordinary appearance has the look of bluster about it, a man trying too hard. Could you imagine Hawke committing the faux pas, for instance, that we saw on the south coast of New South Wales? It's almost impossible to conceive of that. Hawke had seemed genuinely to revel in sport and conviviality, drawing others to him with this powerful magnetism that certainly no one has credited Morrison as possessing. Morrison's efforts in some way recall, I think, some of the performances of Kevin Rudd, you know, that's fair suck of the sauce bottle, and the way in which Rudd, who was clearly, you know, highly educated intellectual, wanted to pretend to be some sort of hick from Queensland for political purposes. He claimed in his autobiography that it was all genuine. He was a real Queenslander and he came from a poor background and a farm and all the rest of it, but it never really, I think, rang true. Now, I'm unaware of any Australian Prime Minister who's managed to burn up political capital as quickly as Morrison has, and for so little return. Only Rudd, perhaps, rivals him in this respect. But Rudd took more than 2 years, where Morrison has taken less than 18 months to burn up whatever goodwill he'd managed to accumulate. For Paul Keating, a comparison to Keating, political capital was finite. And good politics was to burn it up to achieve policy ends that couldn't happen without it. So you began with a kind of stock of goodwill, and you had to make decisions that were hard but necessary, was Keating's conception of it, and inevitably you'd lose skin along the way or burn political capital. But you had to do that to govern well, was Keating's. I mean, he talks about this at great length in that very interesting set of interviews he did with Kerry O'Brien a few years ago. The key was to argue, to educate, cajole, and to hope that luck would run your way when you faced electors, and the integrity, I suppose, of your decision-making would be rewarded, I should say, by those voters when they came to contemplate what is always just a two-horse race between one side and another side. And the classic example of that was surely 1987, where, you know, not very long after the whole Banana Republic crisis of 1986, the balance of payments, and Labor was deeply unpopular, it looked like it was going to lose election. But then, you know, voters took another look in mid-1987 and thought, well, yeah, that wasn't much fun, but I still think they're better than them. Okay, so he burnt up political capital, but had survived. And that was kind of the model that he and Hawke operated under. It might not have been the logic with which they set out, but that's how it looked, at least in retrospect. Many of Hawke and Keating's reforms of the 1980s worked in that kind of way. So did John Howard's gun laws in 1996. So did John Howard and Peter Costello's goods and services tax in 2000. I mean, the gun laws were a serious threat to the coalition. They threatened the National Party in particular in its, in its heartlands. Pauline Hanson, of course, was gathering support at the time. It posed a genuine threat to the government. The GST, contemporaneous with it virtually as an issue, almost lost Howard the 1998 election, and for a time its implementation threatened to lose in the 2001 election. So having gotten through the introduction of it, then he risked losing an election over its implementation. Howard gambled and won each time, and of course skill and luck played a role, but in each case he was effectively burning up political capital that he'd built up over other issues and in other sorts of ways. Now there's absolutely nothing here in this kind of political leadership that is recognisable in Morrison's prime ministership up to this point. Morrison's governed like a political billionaire, and it's often been a remarkable exercise in self-indulgence, although a particular kind of self-indulgence. It's not the same kind of self-indulgence that we saw from Tony Abbott, for instance. I mean, Abbott burned vast amounts of political capital, and perhaps that's the other parallel. I mentioned Rudd as a kind of competitor here, but perhaps Abbott is a better one. Abbott burned political capital on absolute rubbish, things like a knighthood for Prince Philip, culture wars over the Racial Discrimination Act, the 18C stuff, broken election promises that no Senate controlled by a crossbench of that kind was ever going to pass. Morrison's self-indulgence, has been of a different order. He has wasted some political capital on culture wars, but generally I think that hasn't been the main story. I mean, obviously one of the big culture wars issues at the moment is this religious discrimination stuff, the anti-religious discrimination bill. But that hasn't been the main story so far. Morrison's waste of political capital has been much more personal. It's been about very highly personalised misjudgments around decision making, admittedly always with as background the policy failures over climate change and anthropogenic climate change, and energy policy more generally. So that forms a kind of a backdrop and a context that's critical in understanding all this, but it's insufficient, I think, in explaining the individual cases of misjudgment that I've already been talking about. And that's real. I mean, Morrison's been quite profligate in a way in burning up political capital, through the Hawaii thing, which was kind of just fatuous, and one could name any other any number of incidents, particularly I think over the last 6 months. It was revealed, for instance, in the midst of all this, that Morrison and his family had received thousands of dollars in upgrades on a family trip to Fiji in the middle of the year. They'd occupied a $3,000+ per night villa. There's nothing improper about this, and we know how much politicians from both of the major parties love their freebies and bargains and discounts and upgrades and all the rest of it. But remember the marketing exercise with which he'd set out. Okay, that the whole sort of core of what he was presenting to the public was that he was one of them. He was just like them. That the only difference was that he was Prime Minister. But in his lifestyle, his tastes, his inclinations, he was just like everyone else. I mean, it seemed to me that, was potentially at least very damaging in the way that it undercut the central marketing message of his prime ministership. And so his political authority has fallen away more quickly, I think, than anyone could have imagined, even perhaps 6 months ago. And, this idea of him as a kind of performer of miracles now seems rather ludicrous. So with banal phrases such as a fair go for those that have a go, no Australian political leader since John Howard has worked so assiduously to perform a kind of suburban ordinariness, as Morrison has. It's certainly not Malcolm Turnbull, who made much of his use of public transport while he was a minister, but with all that sort of erudition and wealth, he always seemed to me to be rather like an Australian version of a Florentine Renaissance merchant statesman. I think, in terms of the kind of image he sought to project publicly, there are parallels with Howard, but once again with Morrison, he just does it badly, as in that earlier comparison with Hawke. Morrison's religion, which I haven't really mentioned much yet, his Pentecostalism adds another level of complication here. leaving aside the agnostics and the atheists, he's arguably the least mainstream religious believer that we've had as Prime Minister, probably since Alfred Deakin, who of course was a spiritualist in regular conversation at times with people who'd been dead for a very long time. In the Howard era, however, the rise of the religious right and the efforts of the Liberal Party to court it had drawn attention to the political influence being exercised, especially by Hillsong, the Pentecostal sort of mega church as they call them. Morrison's own church is called Horizon. I did look this up on the web a while back. It's a Christ-centred, word-based, spirit-led church in the heart of Sutherland Shire, whose worshippers believe, and I quote, that as we allow the Holy Spirit to reveal his purposes and to presence used as a verb, himself among his church, people's lives will be transformed. Now, the classic Australian plain man is not an evangelical, okay, in the kind of the national mythology. Indeed, in his influential sketch of the typical Australian, in the Australian Legend, written in the 1950s, Russell Ward claimed that the typical Australian was, and I quote, sceptical about the value of religion and of intellectual and cultural pursuits generally. Now, the latter probably fits Morrison, but not the former. Here was a potentially weak point in Morrison's everyman, ordinary bloke kind of persona. And during the election campaign, he did make much of his, or at least strategically, announced his Pentecostal religion. At the National Press Club, he told Australians, "I will burn for you every day." He allowed himself to be photographed, of course, worshipping in his own church, and he subsequently called his election victory a miracle. He ended his victory speech on election night by declaring, "God bless Australia," a reference to the deity that's utterly conventional in US politics, but highly unusual in Australia's. Now, the questions about Morrison have always been there, but it's remarkable how rapidly they've changed over the 18 months that I've been talking about since he won the leadership. At first, the question was, who is he? Most Australians didn't really know who he was. I think polling suggested as much. Then people began to wonder what he believed. Was he a religious crackpot? Before long, and in the absence of anything resembling a vision for the country, they wondered what he was going to do or what he stood for. Over the bushfire crisis, the question became, why won't he lead? And then, why is he acting in this strange way? Now the question seems to be more menacing, of course. Is he corrupt? This is an unfortunate record as a political leader, and he'll need a lot of things to go right to turn matters around. Of course, he has some very large and friendly media companies on his side, at least for now. But if Morrison does fail as a leader, much in the way that a succession of Prime Ministers since John Howard have arguably failed, it will reinforce a sense, I think, that we're dealing with a phenomenon and a pattern, and not simply with a series of unfortunate accidents or a series of idiosyncratic leaders who just weren't up to it. Now, this is the last thing I want to say tonight, last part of the talk. There are many theories around for why this has been happening, the so-called leadership churn and the seeming incapacity for national political leadership, and I can't discuss that question in detail tonight. The rise of 24/7 news, the rise of social media, almost continuous public opinion polling, they've all been blamed for the problems, and I accept certainly that I think the amount of opinion polling has certainly been very destabilising. I'm more sceptical, though, about explanations that focus too strongly or too sharply on the media's role. Yes, there's a lot of media happening across various platforms, but the scrutiny of politicians is often incredibly superficial, it seems to me, particularly of government, and the media cycle moves so rapidly that politicians seem increasingly able to survive scandals that would have finished the careers of politicians a generation or two ago. So I don't think we can put it all down to the media. Others blame the decay of political parties, especially the local branch structure, the party from below. the decay in the Labor's case of the trade union movement, the problem of the recruitment of political candidates. They're coming from a very limited kind of gene pool. Political parties, of course, were once a really tough testing ground for politicians, a place where they learned, for instance, how to prosecute a case. Now, our politicians are likely to have had their training doing the numbers in university politics, perhaps followed by employment as a researcher for a union or a think tank, possibly time as a lawyer or a banker, and very often, of course, a stint as a political staffer. Now, why should we imagine that any of this provides adequate training for politics, and particularly for something like the Prime Ministership, that candidates with this kind of background, you know, it seems to me are very unlikely to have strong roots in their community. They're very unlikely to have built up stores of trust with people in the community that effectively acts as a kind of resource at the point where you enter politics and indeed thereafter. But let me offer, and this is my final point, one possibility, and it's a related issue to the one I've just been talking about, that I think still remains under-discussed as a reason for the kinds of problems of political leadership that I think have been very much a part of our national political culture for probably, we're probably getting towards 2 decades now. Morrison was elected in 2007 and he became Prime Minister just over a decade later in 2018. Josh probably knows all these dates. Do correct me if I get any of these dates wrong, Josh. The numbers for Gillard and Turnbull are very similar. In Gillard's case, 1998 and 2010, and in Turnbull's case, 2004 and 2015. Rudd's accession to the Prime Ministership was even more rapid. It was 1998 to 2007, under 10 years. The major recent exception to this roughly decade-long pathway is of course Tony Abbott, who had almost 2 decades in politics when he became Prime Minister. But I think his deficiencies as a politician were widely known and conveniently ignored as he blasted his way to the Prime Ministership between 2009 and 2013. So it's again a kind of exception that proves the rule. Looking further back, of course, the same could be said of Billy McMahon, the Prime Minister with whom Abbott these days is most commonly and most justly compared. He too had been in politics for well over 20 years, 1949 to 1971 when he became Prime Minister. But listen to the following list. All of the following political leaders had long parliamentary and or ministerial careers before becoming either very or moderately successful Prime Ministers. So here's my list. Menzies the second time, although not Menzies the first time, but Menzies the second time. John Gordon, Gough Whitlam, Malcolm Fraser, Paul Keating and John Howard. They'd all been there for decades. Hawke is the brilliant exception to the rule of longevity, but also again I think the exception that proves the rule. His career as ACTU advocate and then president was so like that of a major national politician that the difference is barely worth noticing, although it probably did affect his parliamentary performances when he became he never liked Parliament and was never particularly good at Parliament. Good at everything else as Prime Minister, but not that. Are we witnessing here the phenomenon of a succession of leaders who simply lacked sufficient experience of non-prime ministerial political leadership to develop the skills, the insights, and in some instances, even the temperament and the resilience to occupy with success a most demanding and difficult job? And I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, Frank. I meant to say something about Prime Minister. I was in this room in 1957 when 2 really pissed blokes turned up on a Saturday. And there was a ping pong table here. We called it ping pong those days. And one of them just wanted another drink and the other challenged my father to a game of ping pong. My mother was very alarmed that this bloke was at this end, and she thought he was going to go through the glass. He was going like this. Father wiped the floor with him. He didn't say a word. He walked straight out the door. Straight out the door. Didn't say, I'll chat you next week when I'm sober. Nothing. That was Robert James Lee Hawke. Robert James Lee Hawke. And it's a true story here. Now, far too much for me. Queries, comments, Ernst.
Frank, you've given us a brilliant analysis of those who made it to the top. Can you say something about those who haven't yet made it? What would you say about the leadership qualities of Shorten and Albanese? How do they fit with your analysis?
Good question. Look, I think Shorten did actually grow into his role as leader of the opposition. I'm not one of those who knocks him. I think he actually often looked and sounded prime ministerial, actually, certainly in the second, from probably about 2016 onwards, after his great success in the election of that year, when he almost, turned out. He almost won that election. It wasn't far away. So I think he was pretty successful. I mean, he clearly exercised a form of group leadership of the kind that I've described, and in his case, it took the form of a strong emphasis on empowering, shadow ministers to do their own thing, to play, a creative role in developing policy. And of course, that's one of the things Hawke's very admired for too, that he trusted his ministers enough. They're very able ministers, but he trusted them sufficiently to do their job properly. And I think Shorten basically seemed to operate in that kind of way. So I suppose the great failing of his prime ministership is that there was, I think in the end, a lack of connection with a sufficient number of voters. He wasn't seen, I suppose, as an inspiring figure. Now, of course, not all prime ministers. I mean, Malcolm Fraser wasn't an inspiring figure either in that kind of sense. In fact, that was a comparison I remember making before the election. So it isn't necessarily the case that some sort of unusual personal charisma is necessary to be Prime Minister or to win elections. But clearly in Shorten's case, in combination with a whole range of other things that were going on around policy, it proved pretty damaging. Albanese, I mean, I don't really know. I have read Karen Middleton's book some years ago. He's got a very interesting personal story. Came from a very impoverished background. His mother was essentially, being brought up by a mother in public housing in Sydney. And I think it's a bit early to tell. I mean, at this stage, his career has been that of a minister in second rank portfolios, I think. He hasn't held portfolios of the very first rank. And to that extent, he's perhaps still somewhat untried in major leadership roles. He hasn't been treasurer or a foreign affairs minister or any of those. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I like to be an optimist, so I would like to see something positive out of the abject failure of our parliament to deliver leadership or positive vision. And the optimist in me says that there's got to be something good about that, and that is that communities come together and look after each other rather than waiting for the government to act. I think that's a positive aspect of the failure of our leadership.
Yeah, look, there's something in that. I mean, one of the things I think we saw over the summer was the great strength of civil society in Australia. And in a sense, the richness of civil society in Australia, the richness of the voluntary ethic, the richness of forms of social, quite informal social cooperation, the richness of all that, I think, was emphasised by the kinds of vacuum that we saw at the national level. I think there was actually more impressive and engaged political leadership being shown at the state level. I think both the New South Wales and Victorian premiers were much more impressive, and they also, I think, had some very impressive MPs who were clearly working hard in their local communities. There were also quite obviously some national politicians who are working hard in their local. Darren Chester comes to mind as someone who seems to have, engaged very effectively with the challenges of his particular part of the world in Gippsland in Victoria. I think, I don't think I'd want to celebrate the absence of good leadership, but I would certainly take the point that societies such as ours, that I think are relatively rich in social capital, don't fall apart because we have a miserable Prime Minister. And I think that's perhaps a point of reassurance. I mean, it doesn't mean there are a lot of problems and dangers in having bad political leadership, but yeah, I mean, I think the strength of civil society in Australia is a great asset to us. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Comments?
Any more? So here we are.
I have a question. Should ScoMo topple over, who do you see coming up behind?
Oh, I don't know. You mean in the Liberal Party? I'm I don't know. I got in my email inbox today a thing from Nick Greiner inviting me to the Federal Liberal Party President dinner with Scott Morrison. I thought, how the hell did these people get my email address? It's quite bizarre. It's like pornography arriving. Like, anyway, I don't know. I mean, people talk about Christian Porter, don't they? I don't know. I have no idea. I think it's very unlikely that Morrison would be tipped out. I mean, what's happened, of course, and Labor began this trend under Kevin Rudd during his second Prime Ministership, is they've changed the rules to make it very difficult to actually remove a political leader of any kind, but particularly a Prime Minister between elections, and indeed Shorten's longevity as leader of the opposition owed something to Kevin Rudd, to the fact that he left behind him in 2013 rules, for instance, you need, for a leader of the opposition, if Labor's in opposition, 60% of the parliamentary party have to basically sign a petition, really, to have a spill. And if you're Prime Minister, Labor Prime Minister, it's 75%, which makes it virtually impossible. Of course, the positions are spilt after each election. And the coalition has now adopted a rather similar system, although without the popular leadership elections that Labor at least has formally adopted and practised once at the federal level. So it's actually very difficult to displace leaders of the major parties between elections. I noticed the other day that McCormack was having a bit of a fantasy about doing the same thing in the National Party, but it doesn't look like the Nats are going to do it. They have quite different traditions, I think. Yeah.
Sorry.
I was just going to ask a follow-up from the question about civil society. What chance do you think there is of civil society really making a difference in the current situation about climate change and about policies in that area, wide-ranging ones?
Oh, well, I think civil society's already made very powerful change. I mean, the nature of the debate that we're experiencing at the moment is, to some extent, a product of the work that's been done by vast numbers of NGOs, by social movement activists. The climate of debate, a better word, around climate change in 2020 is starkly different even from, say, 2007, when the polling was showing that people were concerned about it, and it was something that contributed to Rudd's victory at that election. I mean, we're in a different world, 13 years on, and I think that does owe a great deal to the whole phenomenon we've seen, the children's protests, the Greta Thunberg phenomenon, the role of scientists and activist scientists in promoting public knowledge and understanding. Everything back to Al Gore and his film years ago. I mean, there've been enormous transformations, and much of it, I think, has been due to civil society. Whether you get policy transformation, well, we have to wait and see. The situation in Australia is pretty dire, and that's got a lot to do, clearly, with the immense power of the mining sector and resources industry in this country. I mean, I see the turning point, the critical moment in that was 2010, and Labor and Rudd have a lot to answer for, because they awarded a historic victory to the mining sector in that year, and the mining, and when they defeated the mineral resources rent tax, and you know, it allowed that sector to present itself as a kind of custodian of the national interest, and we're still living with that. I think you know, we're still living with the consequences of that historic victory for the mining and resources sector, and a defeat for the Labor government of the day. Yeah.
Thanks, Frank, for your analysis. That was really great. When I read the synopsis, I thought I want to hear what this guy's got to say. And then this morning, the media was paraphrasing that Morrison, in response to the novel coronavirus, is on the front foot. So, and very much connecting the dots between the poor response during the bushfire crisis to now this situation. Can you reflect on, I want to be a little bit with this lady in the green shirt, is this a positive aspect with regard to, has Morrison learnt something? I think it's a little bit late, but you know, can you reflect on even the last sort of 48 hours in response to Morrison's?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose the reason I was asked to do this tonight, I think Janet saw something I wrote in very early January about this, and I remember the piece I wrote, I wondered at the end about his adaptability. I mean, he'd shown himself very adaptable, obviously. I mean, that was an extraordinary election victory, let's face it. You know, we mightn't like it, but it was extraordinary victory. And it showed his adaptability, the narrative that I developed tonight, you know, where I think he begins by trying to be a kind of John Howard, strong leader type figure, you know, 2001, a Tampa type politician, and then by the early months of 2019, he's doing something quite different. And so I think he has shown himself to be a kind of nimble, adaptable figure. And so he's not to be underestimated in that sense. I mean, he clearly will have learnt from the failures of the summer. I mean, you did see, I sensed, others, you know, might have different views. I sensed there was a moment in early January where he thought his leadership of the nation was in real jeopardy, you know, that things were really falling apart. And he obviously took steps to deal with that. So it may well be that he's learnt something, but the great difficulty is the issue. I mean, the background, you know, to his failures over the bushfires is the whole problem of climate change policy and the lack of, I suppose, space that anyone in Australian politics generally, but particularly on that side of politics, has for constructive and creative policy, given that, you know, it cost Malcolm Turnbull the leadership of the party twice, for instance. You know, that's another lesson he's taken from the past, I think, that Morrison has taken from the past, that you don't mess with that issue within the federal coalition. And let's face it, the situation in the National Party now is quite rancid around these sorts of issues. I mean, that's one of the most interesting aspects, I think, of the situation presently, is what's going to happen in the National Party and what the consequences are for the government, because you know, a split in the National Party is capable of bringing down the government, basically.
Got a question from Josh?
Just two really quick questions, Frank. One has to do with the way that we bunch all of these post-Howard leaders together in one group, as if there's sort of sometimes nothing distinguishing them. But I often see the Gillard government as a unique case within that post-Howard history. I mean, it spent political capital in the Keating mould, kind of, you know, initiating lasting legacies. So I just wondered if you could comment on that and its difference from the other post-Howard periods of government we've seen. The other kind of goes to what you were just talking about the National Party and its leadership troubles. It seems that they haven't had the sort of the strength of a Sinclair-like figure since Ian Sinclair. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about where this history of weak National Party leadership comes from.
Okay, so the first question. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there were some significant legislative achievements in the Gillard government, and I mean, she certainly burnt political capital. I mean, at one stage, was it in 2013? You know, Labor's primary vote in the polls was tracking in the 20s. You know, so there was a drastic burning, a bonfire of political capital case. But it is true that there was some. I mean, NDIS is clearly a significant and lasting legacy, and they, she clearly took some heat out of school funding issues too, which, to be fair to the current coalition, they have tried to build on in constructive ways, although there's been a lot of backtracking in the last 18 months. But, it is also true that on perhaps the key issue, really, in retrospect, which was the ETS, she wasn't able to produce a lasting legacy. It was a good policy that worked, and it's no longer there. And that's a stark contrast with, Hawke-Keating government, Medicare, and any number of other issues, where there policies where there have been lasting legacies. But yeah, I mean, I think in some terms, the Gillard government was a more constructive one than Scott was a hell of a lot more constructive, obviously, than the Abbott government. Yeah, so I'd certainly accept that. Oh, and what was the second point? It was about weak leaders national. Well, surely that's partly to do, isn't it, with the rise of neoliberalism, the kind of stresses that's placed on the National Party's traditional constituency, which really became harsh in fact, about the time Sinclair ceased to be leader, late 80s. One thinks of the Greiner government being a classic example, actually, of this, the late 80s, early 90s. And it's a party that it's a very confused party in many ways. I mean, does it represent miners or farmers, for instance? And what about, where do the people of the regional towns fit into this? I mean, the great achievement, of course, of someone like McEwen was the way in which he was able to kind of weld it all together to protect manufacturing workers in regional towns alongside farmers, through the protectionist order, as it was called, McEwenism, as it's sometimes still called. And yeah, they haven't had figures capable of doing that really, as you say, since the 80s, and it's coincident with a very different kind of economic order that operates very harshly in many regional areas, and which the National Party is simply unable to manage effectively. They've just never been able to manage that effectively since about the time you say, really, since about 1990. Yeah.
One last question.
One quick one. You put McMahon and Abbott into the same basket, but McMahon clearly outweighed Abbott on women.
Mm.
So that's just a comment. And the second one is, where in your topology would you place Harold Holt? Because some of the people that you speak very highly of seem to think very highly of him.
Yeah. McMahon, yes. I mean, there was a women's policy adopted in 1971, wasn't there, which people kind of forgotten because of the Whitlam period, basically, which she was so involved in, Elizabeth. Yeah. So if you want a great read, by the way, Patrick Morgan's biography of William McMahon, Tiberius with a Telephone. I mean, it's about 700 pages, I think, and I managed it in a weekend. That's how readable it is. It's an incredibly amusing book that's as much about storytelling as it is about McMahon, but well worth a look if you want a great read. And yeah, Holt's interesting. I mean, I didn't mention Holt, and I suppose that's partly because his prime ministership was cut short in the way it was. Look, one of the criticisms that was being articulated about Holt by the latter part of 1967, when he eventually disappeared, was that he was a kind of Scotty from marketing, that he too preoccupied with image and PR, that he was a kind of like an advertising man as Prime Minister. So you had, some critics within the Liberal Party and the public service making that kind of allegation. But interestingly, with Holt, there is with Gillard, there is a legislative record of some significance.
Right.
Yeah.
And there is that series, I think it's called Prime Ministers on Prime Ministers, which Whitlam gets up and speaks in, and he mentions Holt very positively, as I recall.
He was clearly a personally likeable man, which helped him. But yeah, I suppose in terms of legacy, you'd look at the liberalisation of the White Australia policy, not the ending of it, but its liberalisation. Finally, 1966 saw the end of the marriage bar in the public service. and of course the referendum, the Indigenous referendum, and the setting up of machinery that occurred after, although some of that didn't happen till Holt, till Gorton, but it would have happened under Holt. So, you know, there was that kind of movement. And yes, I mean, it may be that Whitlam might have found Holt a more formidable rival than perhaps, well, certainly than McMahon and perhaps even Gorton, I don't know. Yeah. Oh wow,
All right, look at this. So I want to formally acknowledge Frank for that fabulous talk. MCH Inc. are really committed to being agile in terms of bringing you guys information as it happens. Is there a news channel that does something like that? Anyway, we're not that news channel. And so when we were brainstorming the talks and the events that we wanted to provide this year, this was certainly one of them around political leadership. And the first person that came to mind was Frank.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you so much, Frank. Here is a beautiful bottle of wine. And I also want to acknowledge the team. So I want to acknowledge David Glynn-Jones, Sebastian Clark, Jan, who is sick as a dog, and she's here working very, very hard. And of course, Patrick, thank you so much for providing your help. We're all volunteers here, so, and we appreciate you coming. So thank you very much. Thanks, Frank.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. I love it. Thank you.
Don't forget, Manning Clark House is about conversation, there's still food and drink
Any possibility
and talk.
I wasn't going to publish, but I can, if you want a text, I can send it to you.
Well, that'd be terrific.
Yeah. Do you have an email that
I do.
Yeah.
I publish a local. It's called the East Lake, so it's really this inner southeast part of Canberra. So it's a quarterly, and I wouldn't do it in full, but also there's a great deal of value in it. So I'll
sure, I can send it to you.
I'll just.
The dismissal, I pointed that out to you the other day. Is that in Sydney, I know. I look forward to it. Is that right? People making you up.